Hi, and welcome to my video playthrough of my open world portfolio piece. I'm happy that you have scrolled down this far, so let's get right into it. I would like to start off by saying that this is a rather large level. The entire playthrough took around 25 minutes. The reason why it's so large is because I wanted to challenge myself with level design on a large scale, get a better understanding of interesting traversal, player choice, but mainly how to keep a player's attention. While guiding the player by bumping them into cars is a rather cheap but effective method, this open world piece explores the opposite. What happens when we let the player take the reins, quite literally. The piece has a rather long onboarding, which is what we're currently looking at. My goal is to introduce the player to the world in a very strict and controlled way. This will make the contrast between the onboarding and the open world even more distinct. To introduce the player, I start off with the basics, such as giving the player a goal, displaying the setting, and showing them the controls. I used guiding lines, reoccurring landmarks, and visual movements to guide the player, and on top of that, I used voice lines from NPCs. When this has been put in place, I move on to introducing the world. Because the world is so large, I need to give the player a sense of direction at all times, which is done by establishing shots, like this one we're looking at right now, of the different landmarks. All the locations have unique names, which is obviously helpful in the long run, but it also becomes a huge info dump, which can be very confusing and annoying. To combat this, I made the player to always be on the move with different NPCs enforcing the player to hurry to the next location. As a result, the player would easily forget the names, but instead focus on the distinct visuals of each area. To always be on the move also removed the tardiness of the info dump. I then slowly let the player have more control, giving them more options little by little. I also introduced combat during the onboarding, and I would like to point out that the combat is extremely simplified because my focus was on open world. If you're interested in seeing how I handle combat, please take a look at my second portfolio piece instead. Anyway, my idea with implementing combat was to have a playable level that had more than just design intentions. Open world games usually have some kind of looting mechanic where the player is awarded something when they find an interesting location. I wanted to implement that kind of award with ammo to at least give the player a basic drive to look around and interact with the world. And the combat is there to support this mechanic, but also to be able to playtest to a further extent. Having enemies in the world makes it feel much more alive and drastically changes the variation of the tempo. At the end of the onboarding, I let the player slowly take over in a pace that fits them. In other words, I wanted to create an environment that would support different playstyles. At this location, for example, I give the player the option to attack a small outpost that the Black Spurs have control over. They can tackle this obstacle however they choose. This also gives me as a designer an opportunity to work on the world building and show that the Black Spurs has a presence all over the level. It also gives an opportunity to the player to get a better understanding of how it is indicated that the Black Spurs are nearby, for example by the Black Spurs flag. After the onboarding has been completed, which is at this point, I tasked the player with eliminating the Black Spurs at certain locations. Some of these locations have been mentioned before, but some haven't. When letting the player freely roam, I wanted to give them an easy first task. By pointing out the first location several times and lining up the player in the correct direction, I could very easily have the player go where I wanted them. On the path over to the first location is where I introduce some of the aspects of an open world, such as the looting mechanic, signs that could guide a player, but also that exploring the world is rewarding. At this point, it was important to keep the player's interest high. I therefore show the player vistas they haven't seen before, used a bait and switch, and created interesting traversal that would require concentration and keep the player on their toes. To also keep the players motivated to continue forward, I show them where they should go but not how to get there. After we have arrived at Winchester Estate, where we are currently, we have some slow-paced combat. I intentionally designed Winchester Estate to have two designated exits or entries. My idea was that I could have better control of how the player moved, and even if they didn't follow the main path, I would still be able to guide them to their next objective. The combat and flow of Winchester Estate is at a very basic level. To reiterate, my focus was how the player would find Winchester Estate and what would happen after. With my time frame of 7 weeks to create this portfolio piece, I thought it was more important to focus on the big picture instead of the smaller details. Still, it was important that the player could understand the importance of this location and get some kind of sense of progression. The player also has to use up most of the ammo that they have found along the way, which gives the player an external motivation to keep looking for ammo boxes. After we have eliminated the Black Spurs at Winchester Estate, we move on to a drawbridge. Following the main path, the player finds an outpost with a casino. They are informed how the Black Spurs raided them last night and demanded payment for protection, but the more important information is that they were heading towards Lunar Lode, which is the place that we were tasked earlier to go to. So following the path, the player gets multiple sightlines of both the lighthouse and the large rock in the middle, which are used by the player to be able to navigate themselves more easily. The player is also presented with a point of interest. The NPC will highlight again that the Black Spurs are heading towards Lunar Lode, and behind the NPC is a sign that indicates the direction of where Lunar Lode is located. Again, the player is then presented with an opportunity to take out more of the Black Spurs. The bridge serves as a point of interest. In comparison to the rest of the world, the bridge is a man-made and stands out in the environment, which draws the attention of the player. Another purpose of the bridge is to funnel the player, which gives me as a designer more control of how the player moves. Either when they enter or exits the bridge, I can control to a much further extent what the player sees and what they should pay attention to next. Coming up is Lunar Lode, and what we can see here is something that I've tried to design throughout the map. What the player first sees is a water wheel, which in turn indicates that there is some kind of civilization nearby. My design intention is that the player should have an informed choice of what they're running towards. By hinting at upcoming locations, I give the player agency. At Lunar Lode, we are informed that the Black Spurs raided a boat, but they're on their way to redemption, and something that stands out in Lunar Lode is the man-made elevator. The intention behind this elevator is to have the player feel an urgency, and the elevator is there to support this. We are currently making our way to the main city, Redemption, for the final showdown of the level. At this stage, it was very important that the player finds their way. I've used both signs, points of interest, roads and railways to indicate the direction where the player should be moving, because situations like these require an extreme design. We wouldn't want the player to get lost in the final moments of the level. As we're walking up to the sheriff of the town, the Black Spurs ambushes us from behind. We have a cool shootout in a cowboy theme as the sun is setting, which is what we wished for all along. The level ends with the player being thanked by their accomplishment of eliminating the Black Spurs. I also want to thank you for sticking along this far in my playthrough. As a last note, I would like to highlight that even though this playthrough takes the main path, the level is made to be an actual open world, so the player can themselves choose their own path. Sadly, there isn't enough time to show all the different possible paths the player could take. If you've enjoyed this full commentary playthrough, please have a look at my second portfolio piece. The levels are much more compressed and detailed, and it features fast-paced combat with a lot of verticality. I hope to see you there.